Lyme disease is a problem we've been looking at this programme in recent weeks. Very unpleasant, extremely debilitating. It can also be very difficult to diagnose. Some sufferers are calling for the NHS to adopt new tests that they believe will fill what they think is the desperate need for better diagnostic treatment. In a moment, I'll be speaking to John Caudwell, who is the founder of Phones for You, who's been affected by the disease along with many members of his family. But first, let's talk to the head of the committee at NICE, the National Institute for Clinical Excellence, which sets the NHS guidelines for Lyme disease, Dr. Sol Phibes. Good morning, Dr. Phibes. Do you accept that there are too few people who are suffering from Lyme disease in this country being correctly diagnosed?
I'm not sure that's right. Good morning. The reason for that is that the antibody tests that we currently have for Lyme disease are done in validated NHS labs, and the specialist labs that do Lyme disease tests, both in England at Public Health England and Scotland at the Scottish Reference Lab, do take part in the European external quality control systems. So they all check each other's results against sort of control samples from all over Europe and the European standard labs, and that happens regularly. So although the antibody tests that we use as standard for Lyme disease are not perfect because they're testing the body's immune response to Lyme, not the disease itself, they are pretty good at diagnosing Lyme when Lyme's there.
But there's a problem, isn't there, with people going to their GP, because not everybody who gets Lyme disease and gets the symptoms gets this characteristic rash, and people are not being tested who are suffering from Lyme disease.
Yeah, and the NICE guideline, which was published last year, does ask doctors to test for Lyme if there are symptoms suggestive of Lyme disease. And the problem of people thinking about Lyme disease and doctors thinking about Lyme disease was definitely there before the NICE guideline, and remains now, that the awareness of Lyme disease and to send off the tests and to treat for Lyme is still a problem in the UK because it's relatively uncommon, but that's not the same as the tests are wrong. The tests that have been in the news the last few days, the T-cell tests, are also an immune function test, so they don't detect for Lyme disease directly. And this type of test is notoriously difficult to interpret and gives a lot of false positives and false negative test results.
Is this the German test you're talking about, the ELISpot test? Because we spoke to a young woman on this programme last week who believes that she was diagnosed with Lyme disease using such a test, although pretty late on into her symptoms. And there are others calling for those tests to be introduced here.
So those tests have never been validated across multiple laboratories in clinical trials. And the European Society for Clinical Microbiology, so not just the NHS, very clearly set out a statement last year which said that the cellular tests such as those should not be used until they've been adequately assessed. It's not standard. It's one lab making money from this. And the problem with them is they often say that they're positive when they're not, and they can be positive because of immune activation for many different things. And we know this because the same sort of tests are used in tuberculosis. They're much better in tuberculosis because they've been studied over millions of doses and lots of countries. But they're not a perfect test by any means.
Dr. Sol Phibes, thank you very much for that. And let's talk now to John Caudwell, the Phones for You billionaire who has been a Lyme disease sufferer himself. What problems did you or your family have getting the right diagnosis, Mr. Caudwell?
Well, we were quite lucky, of course, because I'd got the financial wherewithal to get the best doctors in the world, and that's what we did. We only used the same tests as the previous speaker was talking about in Germany. The point about them producing false positives, I can't argue with, because the problem is nobody knows. But what we do know for certain is the NHS produces false negatives. And the reason that we're certain about that is because I visited Ripple and talked to them about why they were getting so many negatives going out when people had got the clinical symptoms that demonstrated that they did have Lyme disease from a clinical symptom point of view.
But we just heard from Dr. Phibes that many people who think they've got Lyme disease don't actually have it.
Their answer to that was that their tests show Lyme disease when they're 100% certain that they've got Lyme disease. So if the test is only suggesting 70% likelihood of Lyme disease, then they produce a negative. Now, that is clearly preposterous, because it's just because there's only 70%, not 100% certainty, is a ridiculous state of affairs when the clinical diagnosis fits with Lyme disease. Now, I don't agree that Lyme disease is that difficult to diagnose, because there's not many illnesses out there, not many viruses or bacteria that I know of that can cause so many multiple symptoms. And Lyme disease can cause a whole syndrome of symptoms right the way through from migratory arthritis, ME, fibromyalgia, depression, anxiety, paralysis, heart issues, stomach, CFS, and many, many more. And in my experience, when people have got 2 or 3 of those symptoms, I'm usually fairly convinced that they've got Lyme disease. And when they then sent to Germany for testing, they're tested positive. Now, of course, that still doesn't mean that they definitely have Lyme disease. They've got clinical symptoms that fit Lyme disease. They've got a pathological test from a German clinic that the UK authorities say is not proven and tested, and I can't take exception with that.
So what do you want to happen? Do you want the German test to be introduced here, or do you think we need new tests that would actually be far more accurate?
Yeah, absolutely that. We don't need the German test. What we need is research into testing to make certain that we can diagnose Lyme disease effectively. I believe there's tens of thousands more people suffering from Lyme disease and suffering devastating consequences who are not diagnosed, who, even if the doctors have looked at them and considered Lyme disease, have maybe not been sent for tests, or if they have been sent for tests, have come back negative. And this is a dreadful state of affairs, because we're not just talking about people with mild symptoms. We're talking about people whose lives are completely and utterly destroyed. And what we really need is a national database that's set up so that doctors start looking at the clinical diagnosis, matching the clinical diagnosis up with the UK test, and if the UK test proves negative, maybe doing a German test, and looking if the combination of pathological tests and clinical symptoms fit Lyme disease, and then doing protocols that would be recommended for Lyme disease, and see what the
Caudwell,
end result is.
We'll need to leave it there. Thank you very much for talking to us this morning.